Thank you. Good. Thank you for joining me again. We're on the final perik of perik Sechet Sukkah, and as Shlomo has just said, we're really only less than a daf away from completion. This final perik Hechalil in Sechet Sukkah, and we're going to start on daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph 56a. It's roughly halfway down, a bit further than halfway down, The Gemara that we learned last week, we're going to pick up on that, and then we're going to see how it was relevant, because we did a lot of Gemara last week, which was not relevant, apparently, or on the face of it, to the Mishnah that we'd learned. So we went last week on really quite a long trek before we can rejoin with the Mishnah, because the Gemara will now pull up the relevance of the Mishnah to that long discussion we had last week. But let me refresh your memories and refresh my own. I'm just going to share screen. Hope it works. Come on. Yeah, there you are. Okay, if you see that, good. Second. So the Gemara brought a machloket. It was also machloket in Mesechet Sukkah, but it was a machloket pertaining to a perik we did a very long time ago, and not the current perik. And so at first would seem not to be relevant to this perik. What was the machloket? It's something we looked at in quite a lot of detail because the Gemara brought in the opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and it became quite a protracted argument. But it's essentially which bracha to say first when you have two brachot. And it's a similar question to which mitzvah you do first when you're presented with the opportunity to do both mitzvot at the same time. What's the pecking order? And I discussed this aspect of pecking order with you. Setting priorities, ordering Seder is a very important principle in Jewish practice and halacha. It's not taken to be almost irrelevant whether you do action A before action B or B before action A. There is significance in it, and it's usually tied into the relative importance of the two in front of you, or the relative urgency of doing one before the other. And there has to be some rationale behind the choice of order. So the Gemara discussed this question. You're on the first night of Sukkot, and you're making Kiddush, and in your Kiddush you have to add on a Leishev Basukkah, because you're going to sit in the Sukkah, and also Shehechionu. The first night of Sukkot, we say Shehechionu. And we say Shehechionu for two reasons, really. It's a bit unusual. Normally we say Shehechionu in Kiddush on the first time of Yom Tov to celebrate the arrival of the new Chag. So Shehechionu is a bracha that celebrates the arrival of a new Chag. We say this for every Chag. But we also say Shehechionu on the first night of Sukkot because we are commemorating the completion of the Sukkah itself, which is a chayfetz shel mitzvah. It's the first time we're sitting in the Sukkah. It's not just the Chag itself, it's the mitzvah of the Sukkah, which comes about as a result of the Chag. So the Shehechionu has two functions. So the Gemara wanted to know, when you're saying these two, which we do at the end of Kiddush, which one do we say first, the Leishev or the Shehechionu? Now we have halacha today, but the Gemara was discussing this from first principles. And the Gemara brought two opinions, that of Rav and that of Rabba Bar Chana. And they were arguing on that order. So Rav said, you first say the bracha on the Sukkah itself, Leishev by Sukkah, and then the final bracha you make is Shehechionu. And then you sit down and you drink your wine. Whereas Rabbi Bar Chana says, first you make the bracha Shehechionu, and then you make the bracha Leishev Basukkah. Leishev is the last one you make in this case, according to Rabbi Bar Chana. And the Gemara gave us the basis on which they argue. What is the rationale of each of them? They're not doing this without a specific set of reasoning. So for Rav, in his opinion, you say the bracha on the Sukkah, Leishev, before Shehechionu, because he holds that Leishev Basukkah commemorates the fact that we're about to fulfill the Chovat Hayom, the mitzvah of the day. What's the mitzvah of the day? Before we take lulav and esrog on the next day, the mitzvah of the day, that first night, is sitting in the sukkah. And therefore, that takes primary importance because it's a Chovat Hayom. We're all here to celebrate Sukkot. What do? We sit in the sukkah. Therefore, we should be making this Leishep Sukkah first. And it takes precedence over the Shechianu. Why? Because even though the Shechianu is Tadir, Shechianu is a mitzvah that comes more often than the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, because Shechianu is a bracha that is made on many occasions during the year. And normally we have a principle, Tadir v'she'eno Tadir, Tadir kodem, that if we have a choice between doing two mitzvot, how do we order them? We do the one that comes more often. We do that one first. And that's a background principle. Nevertheless, Rav says that the importance of Chovat Hayom, of doing the mitzvah of the day, takes precedence over that principle of Tadir. So therefore we say the bracha of Leishev before we say the Shechianu. However, Rabbi Baba Chana holds that Tadir takes precedence over the specific Chovat Hayom, which means Shechianu, which is the more common Tadir mitzvah that we make more often, is the one that we say before we say Leishep Basukah. Even though Leishep Basukah is of primary importance on the day because it's the Chovat Hayom, the duty of the day, it does not take precedence over this principle of Tadir. According to Rabbi Baba Chana, Tadir is always victorious against any other opposition. In this tension between Tadir and the Chovat Hayom, Tadir always wins. That's the opinion of Rabbi Baba Chana. Okay, that was the machlokus between the two. Now, none of this, although it was very important and interesting in itself, had any relevance to the mission that we last did. So we're going to go back and learn the end of the Mishnah and see what it is that the Gemara wants to pick on in our Mishnah in relation to this machlokes on Leishev or Shechianu, because our Mishnah dealt with, if you remember, the Lechem HaPonim and the Shtei HaLechem, the various types of foods that were eaten by all the Mishmaros together when Shabbat fell on Sukkot. And therefore there was the din of Shabbat, which is that you eat the last week's Lechem HaPonim. The Kohanim would divide those loaves between them. And because it's not Sukkot, here we're talking about Shavuot, I'm sorry, Atzeret. And then there's a mixed mitzvah also of the Shtei HaLechem, the two additional loaves, which are a Sukkot, a Shavuot mitzvah. And our Mishnah talked about the order in which the Kohanim are given to eat from the Shtei HaLechem and from the Lechem HaPonim. Which one comes first? So now we'll take this up. If you can look at your sheets, if you have them Nun Vav Amud Beis, it's almost halfway down the widened block. If I'm counting from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 lines from the bottom. Sorry about that. It's not in a convenient place. The first word in that line is Zaman. And you can imagine there's a full stop after that. I just stopped sharing for a moment. And the Mishnah said, and this is the quote from our Mishnah, which is now going to be relevant to that discussion on Shechianu and Leishev. Tanan, Ba'atzeret, Omer lo, Helech Matzah, Helech Chometz. That's the quote from the Mishnah, that if Shavuot fell on a Shabbat, then in the Beis HaMikdash there would be two types of loaves to be eaten. And the question is which order they're eaten. There is the Lechem HaPonim, which is a weekly Shabbat offering. And those breads are eaten on the Shabbat by the incoming Mishmar normally and the outgoing Mishmar, because there's a changing of the guard normally on a Shabbat. And this is a weekly thing. The old bread comes out, the new freshly baked bread comes in. Now, if it's a Shavuot, then as we said earlier on the Chagim, all the Mishmaros combined, all 24. It wasn't on a rota anymore. There were lots of Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. So they would all have a very small part of the Lechem HaPonim. But there was also the Shtei HaLechem, and the Shtei HaLechem is a particular Atzeret or Shavuot loaves, and they also were eaten by all the Mishmorot. So our Mishnah said that Ba'atzeres, on Shavuot that falls on Shabbos, Omelo, the managing Kohen who was distributing all the food to the Kohanim who were serving on that day, he would say, Heilech matzah, heilech chometz. He would say to each Kohen who came for his share of the breads, he would say, first here's a little bit of matzah, and then here's a bit of chometz. And if you remember, I said to you that the matzah and the chometz are really badly expressed over here. Matzah means lechem haponim, because you remember I said to you that the lechem haponim were in fact matzah, even though they seem to be very thick. They were very thick matzot. And the shtei halechem were made of chometz. So essentially, he would hand out to each chometz, each Kohen first, the lechem haponim share. He would distribute the lechem haponim, and then he would say, when you've had the lechem haponim, take a bite of the shtei halechem. And the Gemara believes this to be very relevant now to that discussion and that machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. So let's do it inside the Gemara first, and then I'll come back and just show you how it's obviously connected with the machlokas on which bracha you say first, Leisha Bashuk Sukkah or Shechiyonu. Says the Gemara, the ha-ha-ha. In this case of our Mishnah, where we're talking about how you divide up in what order the lechem haponim and the shtei lechem, the chometz ikar, we know that the shtei halechem is the ikar chovat hayom. On a Shavuot that falls on Shabbos, again, when we say what is the main focus of the Yom Tov in terms of korban, it's the shtei halechem. That's the uniquely Shavuos korban. The lechem haponim is brought every Shabbos, so it's not specific to this day of Shavuos that falls on a Shabbos. It's the shtei halechem which is the normal, the highlight, if you like, which is specific to Shavuos. So that's the ikar. Umatzah tofel, and the matzah, in other words, the lechem haponim is considered to be tofel of secondary importance when it comes, because it's not the chovat hayom. It is just something that's done every single Shabbat and just happens to be Shavuot that falls on Shabbat, but it's not specific to this day. Even if today was not Shavuot, since it's Shabbat, they would have the same mitzvah of eating the lechem haponim. So lechem haponim is of secondary highlight, really, on the Shavuot that falls on a Shabbat. Ukatani, but our Mishnah gave us a sequence and said, Heilech matzah, Heilech chometz. First eat the lechem haponim, and then eat the shtei halechem. And isn't this a tiyufta to Rav? Isn't this a kasher against the opinion that we brought of Rav? Why is it a kasher? Let me just share screen again, and you will see that we have a parallel over here. It's a kasher against Rav because it's essentially espousing the opinion of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. What does Rabbi Bar Bar Chana say? Tadir always takes precedence over the specific chovat hayom. And that's exactly what our Mishnah is saying. Our Mishnah says that you eat first the lechem haponim, which is the tadir, because the lechem haponim comes 52 Shabbosos a year, and the shtei halechem is only once a year. So which is the tadir? Obviously the lechem haponim. Which is the chovas hayom? Really the shtei halechem. That's the real mitzvah of the, specifically attributed to Shavuot. That's the shtei halechem. But the Mishnah says you take the lechem haponim first and then the shtei halechem. So it's following this idea that tadir takes precedence over the chovat hayom. Had it been like Rav, you would have first taken the shtei halechem and then the lechem haponim, because the chovas hayom is the shtei halechem and the lechem haponim is tadir. But Rav says that the chovas hayom takes precedence. Our Mishnah seems to go on hold like Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, that tadir always wins. Tadir always takes trumps, and therefore the lechem haponim, which is tadir, is offered to the kohanim before the shtei halechem. So that is the relevance of our Mishnah here to this argument over here. And the Gemara means to say that our Mishnah, after all, is Tanoic. It's authoritative because it's a Mishnah. It seems to rule that tadir, the lechem haponim, takes precedence. And therefore, we have Rav has a problem. Rav's an Amora. He's espousing an opinion which is post-Mishnaic, and he's not allowed to disagree with a Mishnah unless he has another Mishnah to rely on. And Amora is out in the open. If he doesn't have these are Gemara Amora following the sealing of the Mishnah, he can't disagree with the Mishnah. He can comment on it. He can give a reason for it. He can give circumstances for it. He can rationalize it, but he can't disagree. And over here, it sees that Rav is disagreeing with the line espoused in our Mishnah. So the Gemara says that this is a kasher against Rav. Rav has to retreat, surely. Now, Rav isn't in front of us. The Gemara is putting this through in its academic sense, if you like, in the yeshivot, that when it comes to this machlokas, Rav and Rabbi Chana, it seems as though Rav doesn't have legs to stand on. And the halacha presumably follows that of Rabbi Chana, the tadir takes precedence, which is why the lechem haponim is given to the kohanim before the shtei halechem. That's the Gemara's kasha. Tiyufta de Rav is usually a strong kasha. Tiyufta Rav means, I mean, literally in Yiddish, there's only a translation. Well, I know maybe it's more in English as well. They call it being upgefragen, or whatever the word is, where essentially there's no answer to Rav. Rav can't extricate himself from a position where he seems to be holding a line which is contrary to that of an authoritative Mishnah. But the Gemara answers, yes, he can. And very often you will find that's the case. The Gemara will say tiyufta. In other words, he can't dig himself out of this hole, can he? He's arguing with an authoritative Mishnah. And the Gemara will answer, yes, you haven't got all the facts. Rav also has legs to stand on. So let's see how he answers this. The Gemara says now, Amalecha Rav. Rav would answer to you. And again, remember what we're dealing with over here. Rav isn't in front of us. The Gemara is discussing this probably 200 or 300 years after Rav's death. Rav died probably in the year 200 and something. And the Gemara's, if you like, this dialogue, this discussion in the yeshivas takes place in the 4th or the 5th century. And the Gemara is saying Rav, if he were here, would be able to defend himself against this question that you've put to him, that he seems to be contradicting a Mishnah, which he has no right to do, by saying the following, Tanoihi, he will say, I am fine, even though I seem to rule against the Mishnah, that doesn't bother me, because I happen to be in possession of the fact that my position follows that of another Tana. It's not the Tana of our Mishnah, but it follows that of it's another Tana. And there is essentially then a machloket Tanoim. There is a Mishnaic era machlokus on whether Tadir takes precedence or whether the Chovat Hayom takes precedence. And it's not as simple as what our Mishnah seems to suggest, that there's only one line, that Tadir always takes precedence. How do we know that there is a Tanoic machlokus? We don't see that in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is the Tanoic scene we've been discussing, and there's only one opinion. First, Heilech matzah, Heilech chometz. That takes you only on one opinion. It's the opinion that Tadir always wins. So Amaloch Rav would say to you, Tanoihi, this is actually a machlokas Tanoim, the Tanya, because there is a brisa. Remember, we're dealing here now with a Mishnaic type material in a brisa. Brisa is Tanoic material that was not included in Rabbi Yehuda's canon, which is the Mishnah. Nevertheless, it remains authoritative, but Rebbe chose not to put it in for whatever reason into his Mishnah. So, but it is a brisa, and if you would look this up in the Toseftus and wherever you can find the brisa, you will find a longer version of our Mishnah, which throws extra light on the question of whether the chometz is first or the matzah is first. The Tanya we learned in a brisa. Heilech matzah, Heilech chometz. Those words are identical to what we find in our Mishnah. That the managing Kohen, as he was giving out all these crusty breads, he would say, first, here you have the matzah, and after this you will have the chometz. In other words, first is the lechem aponim, and then there's the shtei halechem, and that's like our Mishnah, that Tadir always wins, and it's like Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Tadir always wins. But it doesn't end there. This is the important thing. It goes on to say, Abba Shal Omer. This is missing from our Mishnah. It's in the Brisa. It's not in the Mishnah. Very common. And so the Brisa gives us more of an expansive scene of the opinions of the Tanoim. Abba Shal is also a Tana. We'll talk about him in a moment. Abba Shal Omer, Heilech chometz, Heilech matzah. The other way around. First, the chometz and then the matzah. First, the shtei halechem, which is the chovas hayom. The real chiyuv of Shavuos is the shtei halechem. That's specific to Shavuos. And then heilech matzah, then the lechem aponim. So there's a machlokus amongst the Tanoim. And our Mishnah gave us only one side of the machlokus. So you thought, hey, we've got a kasher against Rav. But we don't. Because Rav will say, my view follows that of Abba Shal. And according to Abba Shal, first comes the chovas hayom, the chometz, which is the shtei halechem, the particular thing which is Shavuos based, and only then comes Tadir. And that's the same as Rav. Rav also said the same thing. The chovas hayom takes precedence over Tadir on something which is more often. So Rav has good legs to stand on. He holds like Abba Shal. And in this situation, it's not a problem for Rav to hold his opinion and Rabba Bar Bar Chana to hold his opinion. In the question of Leisha Basuka and Shechiyonu, we have essentially a discussion there on the same principles. And it will turn out that Rav will follow the opinion of Abba Shal, and Rabba Bar Bar Chana will hold the opinion of the Tanner, the other Tanner, the Tanner in our Mishnah, or the first Tanner before Abba Shal in the Brisa. They both have Tanoim to rest on, if you like, and to lean on, which means they both are able to claim that their positions are valid. There's a machlokus. It needs to be decided. That's true. But neither of these two opinions can be rejected because they both rely on authoritative Tanoim who espouse the original opinion. It's interesting to know, first of all, that this Brisa brings in Abba Shal. Abba Shal is a Tana. Again, as I say, he's a Tana, but he doesn't carry the title Rebbe. He's not Rebbe anything, and he's not Rav anything. He's just Abba Shal. So it would seem that Abba Shal, he's Eretz Yisrael Tana, but he never was musmach, if you like. He never carried the smicha. Maybe he never wanted to do the smicha exam. Maybe he was too busy. Nobody would mark his exam. More likely, he was one of those Tanoim who didn't want to be known as Rebbe, possibly very modest. And therefore, even though he was recognized as a leading sage, he did not have the title of Rebbe. Now, to have the title of Rebbe and to have smicha enables a person to do certain things and to issue certain decrees in order to he can take fines off people, kanasim, etc., and punish people. Whereas someone who doesn't have smicha can't do this thing. But he could be a greater scholar than many people today who deliberately don't want to take smicha, but they're considered to be amongst the leading sages in the world. They just don't want to take smicha. Why should they have someone say you are musmach to give halachic decisions? They don't want to do that. They simply want to learn. So over here, Abba Shal is one of those. So he's known as Abba Shal, which literally means father Saul, you might say. So, but his name was Abba Shal. As a career, this is also very interesting. What was his career, Abba Shal? The Abba Shal, who is a Tana, argues in many places, primarily, as it happens, his opinions are brought in relation to the activities in the Beis HaMikdash. That's very interesting. He doesn't get himself involved in too many other areas of halacha. When it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, he's very much into it. And indeed, we see over here, he's discussing whether the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash first get the chometz, or first get the matzah, first get the lechem aponim, or first get the shtei halechem. So it's a Beis HaMikdash halacha in which he was very, very much involved. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva and would argue or support the position of Rabbi Akiva. So he lived around the same time as the Bar Kokhba revolt. What was his career? Not the sort of career which is nice for a good Jewish boy today. He was a grave digger. And some of his statements come in relation to the appearance of bodies that he found when he was digging their graves in Masechet Nida. Not a very nice topic, but again, you see that the Tanaim of the time had different careers. There were blacksmiths, there were water drawers, they were grave diggers. Made no difference. There was no such thing as a clean job necessarily, and it's a big mitzvah to be a grave digger. So he was known as a kabron. He was a grave digger. So that's Abba Shaul, and Rav will hold like Abba Shaul. Now, let's just go on just a little bit more on the Gemara. The Gemara now wants to know who we should rule like. Shall we follow the opinion of Rav or Rabbi Bar Chana? Should we follow the opinion of, you like, also the first Tana or Abba Shaul? How do we rule over here? But the Gemara is putting this specifically back again into the language of the machlokus of Rav and Rabbi Bar Chana. Remember, they were arguing on which bracha you say first. Do you say Leisha Basukah first, or do you say Shechianu? Yes, if I just take you back to the screen, and you want to know, you're sitting in the sukkah on the first night, and you have a dilemma. What do you say first? Rav says you first say Leishev, and then you say Shechianu at the end, whereas Rabbi Bar Chana says you say Shechianu, and then you said Leishev. So now we will see that the question of who you rule like is also machlokus. So it's a machlokus about a machlokus. You get this in Gemara, you get a machlokus about a machlokus about a machlokus. You know, who do you go like? The one who's arguing who you go like, for example. Let's go on. But the Gemara will give us a final psak. We'll be very lucky in a few lines' time. It's not always this case. Dorish Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. Rav Nachman, the son of Rav Chisda, expounded the following. Lo kedivrei Rav. We should not follow the opinion of Rav, the Omar Sukkah v'achakach zman, who says you first make the brocha leishep sukkah and then shechianu. But for Rav Sheshes Berei de Rav Idi Omar al hasukah v'achakach zman, that you do follow the position of Rav. So there's a machlokas whether you go like Rav or Rabbi Bar Chana over here. So what happens today? Well, the Gemara actually gives you a bottom line, which it doesn't always do, so we should be thankful. Says the Gemara, V'hilchasa sukav achakach zman. That is like Rav. That first of all you say Leishev Basukah and then Shechianu. And that's what we do on the first night of Sukkot, where we say Shechianu. We say Leishev normally at the end of Kiddush anyway, but on the first night where you're saying Shechianu, you first say Leishev and then you say Shechianu. So the Gemara said blandly, it just seemed to stick its nose out over here and say Hilchasa Sukkah v'achakach. It's not like Rabbi Bar Chana. It is like Rav, that first the Chovas Hayom and then Todir, if you like. The Todi takes second place. Todi takes second place. And by the way, that's not like our Mishnah either. This is like Abba Shaul in the Brisa. We're learning a few interesting things. First, let's take a few interesting observations. The first thing is, the Gemara has brought two opinions to whether the halacha is like Rav or whether it's not like Rav, and then comes out with a statement which is unnamed. Simply says stam v'hilchasa hasukah v'achakach hazman, which means the halacha is like Rav. So who's speaking? We just had a moment ago two named individuals. Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda says it's not like Rav. And then we had Rav Sheshes Berei de Rav Idi, properly named and attributed. The halacha is like Rav. And then the Gemara just says, without telling you who's made this decision. Who's made this decision? The halacha is like Rav. Who's made it? The Hilchasa, no name given over here. So when you're looking at Gemara like this part, the Hilchasa, this unnamed part of the Gemara that comes with a bland statement, usually, and in this case, it is the case, at the end of a sugya, we've finished this sugya at this point in line. The large words are the Hilchasa, Sukkah v'achakach zman, are the words of what we call a stamor, one of the final editors of the Gemara, at a very much later stage. So you have, again, a whole history context over here. You have the Mishnah and the Brisa of the first, second century. Then you have the Rav and Rabbi Bar Chana, who are arguing originally on the order of those brachas in the second to third century. Then you have Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes, who are probably a century later, each of them arguing as to whether the halacha is like Rav or Rabbi Bar Nachman. And then this final statement, Hilchasa, maybe the 5th century. And it's the final words maybe of a Ravina or Rav Ashi, whoever were winding up. And at that late stage, they didn't give their names. Many of the Stamim, or the Rabboni Savuram, are towards the tail end, who were putting the finishing touches to Masechet, to all the Masechtot in Talmud Bavli. They were the finishing touches, if you like, and they weaved together some of the dialogue to put them in a certain order and rearrange the material. They would often add their own final positions in. And this final position, therefore, is the latest position, which would represent the general agreement at the later stage around the 5th century, towards the time which the 5th or even 6th century, towards the time at which the Talmud was sealed. So you come through over here, and a few lines are essentially going through about 500 years of Talmudic history. And this is the final halacha that we say Leisha Pasukah, and then we make the Shechionu on the first night, which, again, just emphasize, means that we don't here employ the principle of Todir. Because if we employed the principle of the more frequent one that always comes first, which everyone knows, Todi Rishenu, Todi Kodem, then we should be making the Shechionu first. It seems that Chovas Hayom trumps Todir. And that's interesting because, as I say, Todir is often espoused as being almost the only principle that matters in terms of ordering. Well, it doesn't. It's a principle that is overridden here, according to our halacha. The other thing that's of interest is that this final halacha over here, that we say first Leisha Pasukah and then Zaman, is not consistent with the opinion of our Mishnah, which did not give you, if you remember, Abba Shaul's opinion. It was the Brisa that added Abba Shaul. Our Mishnah said you first have the Lechem Aponim, and then you have the Shtei Lechem. So that holds Lechem Aponim first, which is Todir, comes before Shtei Lechem, which is a Chovas Hayom. But over here, we're saying the halacha is the other way. The halacha, when it comes to the brachas on the sukkah, is the other way around. So it would seem that the final halacha goes against the opinion stated in our Mishnah, but like the second opinion in the Brisa, that of Abba Shaul. And the point of interest here, really, again, is just in terms of our intuition tends to be that we think of the Mishnah as being authoritative. We think of a certain ordering that leads to the halacha that we have today. And we have the Chumash, which is Torah Shebeksav. And then we have the Mishnah, which is the first set out of Rebbe of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which forms the framework for the next stage, which is the Gemara discussing the Mishnah. And after the Gemara discussing the Mishnah, you have the early Gaonim, and then you have the early Poskim and Mefarshim who understand the Gemara. And eventually this is put into the some of the great works like the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, which is a halachic, if you like, summary of the whole of Talmud Bavli, following the positions of the Gemara and of the Mishnah. And then you have the Shulchan Aruch, which is another layer on top of the of even the Mishnah Torah and those other halachic works. But it's not entirely right, because if it were true, the halacha would be like the Mishnah. But the halacha is not like the Mishnah. The halacha, it seems that Rebbe's great canonized work, which is really the basis on which the Gemara is basing, is entering into all its discussions, which leads to the halacha. The Mishnah here isn't authoritative for our purposes. We've chosen an obscure brisa and taken the view of Abba Shaul, and the halacha is following that view. And I think this, again, I just make this point that you can learn Mishnah, you learn Mishnah as Torah Shebaal Peh, but it's not halacha. And even when if there's no machlokas in the Mishnah, it doesn't mean that there isn't machlokas between Tanoim to be found elsewhere. And over here, the halacha follows the view of one of the Tanoim not mentioned in the Mishnah. So the Brisa wins against the Mishnah, even though the Mishnah is the canon of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. It's very important to get around this idea, this flexibility that you need to have when you're looking at material, that what looks like being the most authoritative material, it is in some ways very authoritative. It's the chosen material of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, but it doesn't include the opinion of someone who eventually comes through as the halacha. Okay. We'll go on now with the Gemara. The Gemara is picking up on something that we said earlier in the Mishnah, which was this: Mishma shezamano kavua, etc. It says there, who makriv tamidim nadir nadorbs. He's only giving you a very small reference there to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says there that on the Yontef, shall we say, which is any regal that where a Shabbos falls on a regal, like Shabbos on Sukkot or Shabbos on Shavuos, etc., that the Mishnah, the Mishmar, the Kohanic family group out of the 24, which would be its normal week had it not been a Chag, because they all have a normal week, as well as one that the week might be the week of a particular family amongst the 24, but because it's a Chag, the other 23 also turn up. But there is the fixed Mishmar HaShavua. They don't go away. They're just part of the Malay, but they still play an important role on the Shabbos, which is their week, even if it's the day of Chag and all the other Mishmaras are there as well. So that particular Mishnah, for which it is its week to be in the Beis Hamikdash, they're the ones that offer the non-Chag related karbonos. We already mentioned this earlier on, because even on the Chag there are Nedarim and Nedavot and Shlomim, all sorts of other karbonos that people want to bring as gift offerings or vow offerings that are nothing to do with the Chag. The Chag has specific karbonos, and those are the ones that are divided amongst the 24. All the specific karbonos, the musafim, etc., like all those 70 bullocks that were offered up on Sukkot. But the stuff that comes all the time, that is not specific to the Chag, that is given through to the Mishmar HaKavua, the particular Mishmar, the particular family group for whom it is that week, because they're doing the normal business, if you like, the normal business, and it's the specific Yontef business that is divided amongst all the 24. Ushar Karbonos Sid, and also all the other Karbonos Sibur. Now, if you look at the Mishnah, the Gemara is going to ask a kasha, because the Mishnah states what a lot of the examples of what the Mishmar Kavua, the normal week's Mishmar, would be doing. And it mentions, without me taking you back to the Mishnah itself, Tomid, Nadarim, and Nadavos as being the normal Karbonot Tzibor, which are still given to the group that has its normal week for this week. And then it says, Usha'ar Karbonot Tzibor, and any other Karbonos Sibur. The Gemara's kasha is, what's Usha'ar Karbonos Sibur? Because within the specifics which the Mishnah mentions are Tamidim, Nedarim, Unadovos. So at a first guess, that includes all the Karbonos Sibur we know about. All the communal Karbonos are included in the Carbon Tomid, the Nadarim, the stuff that people bring in as a neder, and Adovos and gift offerings. Those are all the other Karbonos besides that of the Chagim. So what's missing? There should be no statement in the Mishnah that has no meaning. And since the Mishnah goes on to say Sha'ar Karbonos, it must be coming to include other types of Karbonos we haven't thought of. So that's the Gemara's question. La'asuye mai. La'asuye mai always means, what is this additional term in the Mishnah coming to include over and above those things that have already been specifically mentioned in the Mishnah? And we specifically mentioned Tomid, Nadar, and Adovos. What else is there in Sha'ar Karbonos Tzibur? It must play a role because it's mentioned in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, La'atuye pa helam dova shel tzibor. This is a little bit of a complicated korban. We'll just have a look at that very quickly. Or seiri avodas kachavim, and also the goats that you bring for people who are being oved avodah zara. Over here, we're talking about specific korbanos, which we find in Parshas Vayikra, that are brought on very unusual occasions. They're considered to be korbanos tzibah, but they're not brought very often. They may only be brought once in a yovel, who knows, because they come only in relation to specific circumstances. And when it says usha'ar korbanos tzibah, it's referring to these unusual event-driven korbanos. So let's have a look at least the first one. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. Okay, it's not this. Let's have a look at the psukim here. This is the pa helam dova shel tzibor, which is very complicated. It's event-driven. So let's read what the psukim say. The first pasuk says, "Ve'im kol adas Yisrael yishku." If the whole Jewish people should err, E-double-R, that means go astray and non-intentionally violate a halacha. If they should all non-intentionally violate the ne'elam dova, and the matter was unknown, me'enei hakahol, from the eyes of the congregation. Now this is very interesting. What does it mean? The matter, in other words, their violation or the halacha which they violated was hidden from the eyes of the congregation. We're not playing here a game of hide and seek. What does it mean? They were hidden. The Einei HaKahal refer to the Sanhedrin very often. And because Chazal say that who are the eyes of the congregation? In other words, who's looking out for the congregation? It's leadership. In other words, the flock themselves just follow wherever they wish to trample. The eyes of the congregation are the leaders. They're always looking ahead and trying to ensure that the people don't err and don't trip and don't fall. But somehow there was a halacha which the Sanhedrin was unaware of, which seems like an extraordinary thing in itself. There's a lot of discussion about this, but let's just take this for granted for a moment. It was a serious violation for which, had it been intentionally violated, a person would be subject to kores, which is a very severe punishment that they essentially cut off from the soul of the Jewish people. A very serious violation, but the people violated it because their leadership, the Sanhedrin, did not advise them to do otherwise because they were in some ways ignorant of that particular halacha. Now, here we can only be talking about a detail, maybe. They didn't know something which was a detail. That detail wasn't given to the people, so the people in a large scale violated it. So we have the whole tzibor being shogegim, unintentionally violating a halacha of great seriousness because their leadership wasn't able to keep them away from it. And therefore they violated something that they should not have done. They did something they shouldn't have done. And then and then it becomes known that they made that mistake, because if it never becomes known, then there is no way you can remedy it. But now it's become known, then what happens? V'hikrivu hakahal, the whole congregation are participants in being makriv pa ben bakar, a young cow, lachatos, as a sin offering, and they have to bring it in front of the Ohel Moed. In other words, this is the pa he'elem dava we're talking about. It is a korban sibah. It is a congregational korban because essentially it is a kapara for all the people who made that mistake. It's non-intentional. If it had been intentional, you could not have a kapara through a korban. But because it wasn't intentional, and yet it was a violation, which is still serious, a non-intentional violation still carries with it the need for atonement. Therefore, the korban pa he'elam dava is brought as an atonement. And this is the additional sha'ar korbanos. This is one example of, and this is an event-driven korban, because it's only brought because of this terrible event that they violated unintentionally. And what happens further on? The somchu ziknei ha'edas yedema rosh ha'pah lifnei Hashem. The ziknei ha'edah, they are the elders of the congregation, like the Sanhedrin. They should place their hands on the head of the poor before the ritual carries on with the offering up of this carbon. In a sense, the Ziknei Ha'ed are involved here. You can't have all 8 million Jews placing their hands on the single par Helam Dover in the carbon in the Beis Hamikdash, but they're essentially all carrying some level of blame, and they need a kapora. But who brought them into this situation in the first place? The Ziknei Ha'eda, the Zikanim, which means the leadership, the Chachamim of the day, who weren't able to prevent this happening because they were unaware of whatever detail it led to this serious violation. They're the ones who have to lay their hands on, as if to say, it's on our heads. And we essentially are the ones that should be offered up as a carbon because it happened on our watch. So this is the Inyan of the Par Helam Dova. The next case of Se'ire Avodas Chachamim is a little bit similar. That again is a very unusual event-driven disaster where the people erred and they in some way violated the Isser of Avodah Zarah, of idol worship. So it's not just an ordinary, if you like, violation of even a serious mitzvah, it's a violation of the most serious of them all, of Avodah Zarah. And that's because in some way the leadership again didn't make them aware of some practice that they shouldn't have practiced. I can't think offhand of a non-intentional violation of a detail of an Avodah Zarah, but why should people get involved in any marginal aspect of Avodah Zarah in the first place, so that they cross the line and therefore over here violate? It's very difficult to know what an example would be. But assuming there is such an example, then they'd have to bring a particular carbon again as a kapara for the Jewish people. And it would be up to the leaders of the congregation again to take responsibility for not being able to prevent this violation, not having informed the people that whatever practice it was wrong. And these are the examples of Sha'ar Karbonos Tzibah, the Se'ir Avodas Kachavim and Par Helem Dava. Again, very unusual Karbonos. We don't know when they would have been brought, but they would have been brought occasionally during Bais Rishon, maybe in Bais Sheni, very rare. Those also would have been dealt with by the Mishmar Kavua, by the family grouping for which this was their normal Shabbat, because this is not a Yontef related carbon. It may be a very important carbon, but it's not related to the Chag. It doesn't relate to Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. It would have been brought on the day of the week or on a Shabbat, even if it had not been Chag. So therefore it would be given over to the Mishmar, whose normal rota it would be for that week. And then the Gemara finally takes the last words in the Mishnah, again, which it finds to be irrelevant. Our Mishnah went on to say, V'hu makriv as hakol. That Mishmar Kavua, that Mishmar for whom it was their weekly rota for them to be on Shabbat, would be makriv as hakol, would offer up everything. So this last words of the Mishnah seem almost to be a contradiction. We brought all sorts of details. We said this Mishmar Kavua gets involved with a Tomid, with an Adorim, with an Adorvos, with a Par Helem Dava Shel Tzibah, and the Se'ire Avodas Kachavim. Well, that's it. Why does it go on with this general statement to say that they would be makriv es hakol? That's what the Gemara wants to know. Again, it's an additional general statement in the Mishnah that doesn't seem to have any specifics associated with it. Surely we have exhausted all the specifics for this Mishmar Kavua. So what does it come to include? La'asuye mai, again, what does it come to include? What additional aspect of hakrava, of carbon, haven't we already mentioned for this Mishmar Kavua to do? So the Gemara says, La'asuye kayitz hamizbeach. It comes to include the Kayetz HaMizbeach. What's the Kayetz HaMizbeach? So it's interesting. There was a practice in the Beis Hamikdash, we'll explain what this Kayetz HaMizbeach was, that the altar, the Mizbeach, should never be idle. if you know what I mean. In other words, there should always be some carbon of some sort still stewing, if you like, on the pile of wood on top of the Mizbeach. Right? It should not be unemployed, and that might happen. You have various, we have the regular Karbonos Tzibah, we have the Yontiv Karbonos, we have Nedarim, Nedavos, and Shlomim. There's always stuff coming on, Karbon Chatas, all this stuff is coming on all the time from the people. Some of the bringing every day of the week, some might be particular with Shabbat, some might be to do with the Chag, some may be event driven. But what happens if it's a quiet period? I just Lag BaOmer. Everyone's going to have their mangel somewhere. They don't want to bring their matonos to the Beis Hamikdash today. There's no specially konvornas. So for a few hours, the Mizbeach is idle. So what you going to do? So it seems that there were specific, if you like, animals awaiting to be put up as korbanos of the Mizbeach at that period, just for those idle periods, so that the karbonos, there would always be something burning up on the Mizbeach. So at a period when nobody was actually giving them karbonos to be fed onto the Mizbeach, they would go to this spare pile they had on the side, under the table, and take out their lamb or goat or whatever it is, and that would be put on the Mizbeach, shechted and put on the Mizbeach, etc. And those were called kayits. And there's a question mark why they were called kayits. This was the kayits HaMizbeach, the animals that were put onto the Mizbeach during these idle periods. And those are also Karbonos Tzibah. They don't belong to anyone individually. It's not because the Yenim person bought them up. They had them ready in the Beis Hamikdash just for a time when it was idle. And that hasn't been mentioned so far. So the idle Karbonos that are nothing to do with Yontif or Shabbos, simply put in as gap fillers, those are the ones that are intended in the meaning of the Mishnah when it says makriv es hakol. Even the kayitz hamizbeach, that would be for the mishmar hakavua, for the normal rota mishmar to use. Now the words kayitz does appear in Tanakh. I mean, kayitz often means, like you might think it means summer or something like that, but it actually in the book of Shmuel and other places seems to mean dried figs of some sort, but what's so special about dried figs? Well, maybe if you were living 2,000 years ago, you would know that figs and dates came in at the end. They were brought on as a dessert at the end of the meal, as a kinuach. You like as the afikoman, you might say, if you want to use another form of parallel we have at the end of the meal. Kinuach Suda means something you bring at the end just to finally make your food to go down. You just had your fatty, oily meal, foods, etc. So just before benching, you might bring on a kinuach. So the kinuach was the final dessert that you brought on. And they were from these dried figs. So they want to say that this is why the word kayetz hamizbeach, where it got its terminology from. Yeah, because you brought on everything that you really needed to so far, all the korbanos that were really needed for the day and that people brought in, and now there's nothing left. Yeah, so what are you going to do? So it's the dessert. It's a dessert after the main courses. So you would bring on some of these additional animals, and they were known as the kayetz hamizbeach. And that takes us actually to the end of this Gemara. Actually, a good place to stop, I think. I could start the next Mishnah, and I won't start the next Mishnah. We'll stop over here. And the next Mishnah also gives us some very interesting material on the Beis Hamikdash, and it will bring us to a interesting story about one particular mishmar of the 24 mishmaros that was penalized and punished by the Kohanic staff management team, if you like, for misbehaving. And we'll see what penalties were introduced to penalize that particular mishmar. So there was, if you like, there was not only administration, there was also discipline. There was a disciplinary team in the Beis Hamikdash who would punish those people. Just received a signed out mission, it was not us, who were not behaving formally, and even the Kohanim themselves would be penalized by that disciplinary team. Just going to stop recording.